Well, welcome back to Special Report. Former President Trump has been fighting to protect children in our American education system from bad actors seeking to corrupt young people's way of thinking. Our next guest, investigative journalist, author, and filmmaker Alex Newman, joins us now to discuss this very issue.
Alex, thank you so much for being with us today on Special Report.
It's great to be here. Thank you guys for having me.
Alex, your new book, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death, argues that the education system in America is not broken, but used to dumb down and sexualize children instead. Tell us more about what we can learn from this book.
Well, again, thank you guys for having me. And a lot of people hear that and they think I'm just being emotional or that I'm just theorizing. We've got the receipts. We've got the proof. And so what I did in the book is we went back through the history of how the government came to control education. And we've got the smoking gun primary source documents showing that the people who built this system always intended to use it to turn our children against God, turn our children against their country, turn our children against their family, and ultimately radically reshape not just America, but the world. So that is provable. It's demonstrable. And I think what you started with is the most important thing for people to understand. We have to stop thinking that we can fix the broken system and start recognizing that the system is doing very well at its intended goal, which is dumbing down, sexualizing, and indoctrinating our children to reject everything that our country was founded upon. It is, I believe, the single most dangerous threat to not just our children, but our families, our churches, our communities, and our country.
And our future, Alex. Wow, that is certainly investigative journalism at its finest. You also have a new movie available now for streaming. It's called Beneath Sheep's Clothing. We were able to watch a quick clip of that right before we welcomed you on the show. It's being described as a wake-up call to everyone with children in schools, to Christians, and to anyone who cares about freedom. You argue Soviet tactics to overtake education and religion are prevalent in America today. Can you explain what tactics you're specifically referring to here?
Well, one of the very obvious connections to what is happening today in America under the guise of education in the Soviet Union is not even difficult to uncover. John Dewey, who's almost universally recognized today by everybody in the education field as the founding father of what we call the public school system in America. And I think in fairness, he deserves to share the blame with some other nefarious characters. But he's considered the founding father of our system. We know what he was thinking. He went to the Soviet Union and he wrote a series of articles for the New Republic singing its praises, especially its so-called education system. He was so glad that they were instilling what he described as a collectivistic mentality in the minds of children. He wanted to see that in the United States. Now, in his defense, he didn't believe that violent revolution was the best way to achieve that, but he shared the same objective. Collectivism, get rid of private property, get rid of the family, and he even shared the same religion as the Soviets. He and his buddies got together and they created the Humanist Manifesto, which rejects the existence of God, holds that the universe is, as they put it, self-existing and not created. And I want people to recognize real quick, first of all, that conflicts with the very first words in the Bible. In the beginning, God created. Second of all, it is fundamentally incompatible with our system of government, which is based on what our founding fathers said was the self-evident truth that God created us and that he endowed us with rights. Well, if he doesn't exist, he certainly didn't create us. He certainly didn't endow us with any rights. So you fast forward all the way up to the 1980s. My late friend Charlotte Iserby, who served as senior advisor to Ronald Reagan on education policy, discovered that the U.S. and the Soviet education systems were being harmonized in a way that was designed to destroy the United States and lead us toward a one-world system. So the connections are everywhere. And parents, if you have children, there is nothing more important right this moment than the facts that we're sharing with you here.
Alex, what do you think is the biggest threat to American education systems today? And now that we have a regime change in Washington going back to Donald Trump, what are you optimistic about that Donald Trump can actually do with our education system?
Well, one of the things that I think is so profoundly significant on education with Donald Trump, not just taking down the Department of Education, which is obviously a good idea. Obviously, the Department of Education is unconstitutional. It never should have been created. But it's the fact that the discussion has entirely shifted. For generations in this country, we have talked about how do we reform the system? How do we fix the system? For me, that's like asking, how do you want to reform your cancer? Well, I don't want to reform the cancer. I'd like to get rid of it, please. It's like asking, how do you reform collective farming in the Soviet Union? It's a preposterous question. You want to get rid of collective agriculture if you want productive, good farming. And so what Donald Trump is doing now is reshaping the conversation. We are now talking at a national level about what's the best way to get children out of this system as quickly as possible. And that's the way the debate's going to go. Over the next few months, you will hear us having now a national debate about this issue of school choice. Should the government fund private schools and homeschools? And, I personally have some very serious concerns about that. I think there are dangers because what the government funds, the government likes to control. But that's the direction the debate is moving in. This is an earthquake when it comes to the $1 trillion a year public education system. And the changes that are coming are going to be so massive and so profound. I think this is a time to celebrate. It's a time to get serious about this. And it's a time to recognize that we all have to be active here. This isn't something just for politicians to talk about. Parents, you need to reclaim your authority and your responsibility over the education and the upbringing of your children, because if you don't, politicians will make very, very bad decisions for your kids.
Yeah, Alex, it's really interesting that you bring up school of choice. A lot of private schools are Catholic schools, and I'm a very proud former Catholic school student. For years, we've seen religion getting banned entirely from schools. So do you think that bringing back some, not necessarily Catholic, but Christian values to schools could help future generations?
It's absolutely essential. I mean, the Bible was the primary textbook in this country for children for hundreds of years. If you had told people, even in the early 1900s, that the Supreme Court would rule in 1962 and 1963 that we couldn't have the Bible in school, they would have carried you off to the funny farm. It would have been so preposterous. How do you do education without the Bible? So I'm very pleased to see what's happening in Oklahoma, where the Bible is back in school. I'm pleased to see what's happening in Louisiana and Texas. You cannot have a legitimate education without God at the center of it. Proverbs 1:7, Proverbs 9:10 tell us that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So no matter how this debate shakes out, I hope all Christians, and the overwhelming majority of Americans today describe themselves as Christians, I hope all Christians will recognize this was a subversive agenda from the very beginning. And the justice who wrote the dissent in that case, his name was Justice Potter Stewart, he explained that what the Supreme Court did in the early 1960s was not create neutrality with respect to religion. Rather, he said, they established the religion of secularism, or as John Dewey would have put it, humanism. They have been teaching our children a false religion from the pit of hell with our tax money, with compulsory education laws for going on 3 generations now. That's why our society is falling apart at the seams, and we will not be able to fix it properly without addressing that very issue.
Alex, I have a 9-month-old. He just actually turned 9 months yesterday with this this election. It's amazing. You're giving me so many things to think about, and I'm sure that there's some young parents out there that have to be thinking about education moving forward, because what you're saying is so true. Before Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene left our studio just a few minutes ago, she wanted us to talk about the fact she has something called the Protect Children's Innocence Act, which I think is great. It looks like what she's saying with this House and Senate sweep, they're going to be able to get legislation like that passed. And I know that you spoke at Mar-a-Lago. You gave a speech on education not that long ago. What are some of the things that you talked about? I know you mentioned that the former president-elect wasn't there, but his son was. What are some of the things you talked about with that audience?
So really, the goal was to show people what you started this segment with, that the system is actually working as intended. And that, I think, is step one, right? When you go into a doctor's office, the first thing the doctor has to do is give you a diagnosis. They have to tell you what the problem is before we can start talking about treatment options or cures. And so my goal with that talk, that was a few months ago at Mar-a-Lago, was to just show people, look, we have to give an accurate diagnosis here. The problem is not that the system is broken or that we need some new reform or some new funding or some different class sizes. The problem is the system itself. We have to dismantle that system. And so I would urge parents in the strongest possible terms. I have 6 kids myself. We homeschool them. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I wouldn't give it up if you put a gun to my head. I would urge parents to think about this, pray about this, because there are almost no decisions you'll make in your entire life that are more significant, not just for you and for your children, but for future generations, than how your children will be educated. I believe homeschooling is the gold standard if you can do it. Not everybody can. There are great Catholic schools, Protestant schools, great private schools out there. But parents, this is the hill to die on. If we get this wrong, everything else is lost.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like that speech you made at Mar-a-Lago was pretty impactful. President Trump was just there last night celebrating his big victory. So I want to ask you what you make of his win and what you would like to see him do on day one when he gets to the White House.
Well, I appreciated what your last guest had to say. I do believe God's hand was in this. And, the Bible talks about that, how God raises up kings and removes kings. So I don't believe this could have happened without God's grace. We certainly don't deserve it as a country. But I am elated to see Donald Trump returning to the White House. And he has spoken very clearly, even during his first term. He talked about we have to protect our children from the failing government schools. I couldn't agree more with him. I think that needs to be one of the central focuses. I know we've got a lot of crises. We've got the border, we've got China, we've got the inflation. All these things are serious. But ultimately,
so many serious issues. And Alex, I'm so sorry. I really don't want to cut you off, but I do want to give you a chance to tell our viewers where they can go to watch your film. BeneathSheepsClothing.movie, and the book is available at Amazon, Indoctrinating Our Children to Death. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for being here, Alex.